the response that you're getting from AI, can you trust that? So you say, what is the best, software for blah, blah, blah? And they say it's C1Risk. Do you trust that? So that's one aspect of a scenario. I think we need to be very mindful of coming up with the right set of standards of how you build AI software so that it has a level of transparency for users to trust that information.
That spark of innovation, it's just waiting for the perfect combination of tools and talent to bring it to life. Welcome to Pitch, Build, Scale. I'm your host, Chris Fanchi, a recovering startup founder, veteran SaaS marketer, turned dev tech enthusiast and growth specialist. Each episode, we connect with the builders, the visionaries, and the problem solvers who are redefining what's possible with today's technology and pioneering the websites, apps, and software products of tomorrow. These are the conversations that transform how we build, how we sell, and how we scale technology businesses in a world where the tech evolves by the minute. Ready to stay ahead of the curve? This is Pitch, Build, Scale. Hello and welcome to today's episode. We have a very exciting guest. For those of you just joining the podcast, we are Big North Marketing and specialize in helping dev shops and SaaS companies scale their revenue. So if you want to learn how to take your SaaS or dev business to the next level, make sure to stick around. And if you're interested in a free growth consultation, just drop us the word growth in the DMs. We're really excited to have today's guest. Lily Yeoh is the founder and CEO of C1Risk, a governance, risk, and compliance platform helping enterprises streamline cybersecurity programs with automation and AI. She brings a powerhouse background in security from Deloitte to Aviatrix to RSA, and now leads the charge at C1Risk, where the future of risk management is being built. Lily, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Well, thank you for coming on. So I like to start with everyone's origin story. How did you first get into the world of technology and then specifically cybersecurity?
Yeah, well, that's kind of an interesting story. I grew up in the 70s era, 80s, and then 90s when technology went through the boom of networking, and the rest was history with the internet. And so it's always been a really exciting thing for someone like me who's been pretty geeky at school. I love math and science. The typing class and being the fastest at typing was like, such an accomplishment. And then growing up, I got my first PC in high school and just fell in love with it. Just really love the internet community. I remember the early days of the online community. Everything was like Linux prompt at that time. And we were able to jump into I was able to jump into a lot of channels to connect with different communities, mostly through schools and then later on universities. So that's how technology for me started, was connecting in university network all across the world. And I thought it was really interesting. And as I went through college, initially I studied biology and chemistry, thinking that I was going to go into healthcare. But what made me fall in love with technology was just being in the computer lab and messing around with the early days of HTML web pages, and then it got more sophisticated into like dynamic pages, and I just really wanted to do more with technology. So it was more of a passion to start, and then I wanted to formalize that with education and the right courses for me to be able to keep building, and that's what I did. So I got a master's in management information system. I chose that route because I didn't want to work on kernels and OS level systems. I wanted to use technology to apply in real world like business applications. Basically, the software side of things where people actually find useful, only in what consumer is using for the internet, but more importantly, I was really, really interested in how do we use technology to make company and products more efficient. So that was my initial school drivers. And when I was in grad school, I had an amazing opportunity to do an internship at a large semiconductor company called Texas Instruments. Time I did my internship in cybersecurity because it was a course that I didn't have, and we didn't have courses in cybersecurity back then in at that time period. And so I thought, hey, this is really interesting because I've learned about how to do programming, how to do networking, but I don't know anything about cybersecurity. So I went into that, and my first project was about cryptography, and the rest was history. I just like really fell in love with it. I think that in the world of cybersecurity, you really need to be very curious and take a lot of initiative and have creativity to understand all the different threat vectors and the path like adversary can get to you. And it's all anywhere from social engineering, which is very much like people and psychology, all the way to the technology of what they can do, where their backdoors are. And so it requires, a person to have a really depth of knowledge in not only like really understanding people, but also really understanding the bits and bytes of how technology work at every layers.
Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. How have you seen cybersecurity change over the years, having been in it for as long as you have now?
Yeah, like 25 years, a couple decades. Yeah, I have seen it grow up. So when I first started, I was working for Fortune 50, company, very large globally. And it was a global company, and we were protecting the intellectual property of our semiconductor chips. And back then, we were getting email viruses. And it eventually morphed very quickly into worms and DDoS attacks, into the network and things like that, taking down big corporation from their network. And so back then, our manufacturing plants were pumping out chips, and they were supporting like millions of dollars per minute. And so when manufacturing companies go down, you could lose like millions of dollars. So we needed to make sure we are protecting all those threats into the network. And the threats back then were very much email based, social engineering based. You have Kevin Mitnick making phone calls and tricking people to give him information. And that quickly morphed into a nation state threat because during my time in the early days, it was very much like started off with script kiddies. We call it script kiddies because they're like not very highly organized. They're maybe kids or very novice, curious people that are, like snooping and getting themselves in trouble into creating these damages on our network. But it eventually morphed into like more organized crime. And those organized crime were a lot more sophisticated because you have a group of people who are operating in the same agenda to try to take down something to cause harm to companies or to attack for the purpose of monetary gains.
Mm.
So it eventually morphed into something more sophisticated. And then eventually, within like about 10 years or so, we started talking about cyber wars. So we are at a nation state cyber warfare. So imagine physical wars where people are actually fighting on the ground. We are doing that in the cyber world. And so it became nation state threats. So Russia, China, Middle East, they were attacking Americans and American companies and government network. And so that's where we are today. We have cases of that with Cambridge Analytica, what happened, and then, many other examples of ransomware to our energy sector and different infrastructure. So that's how I've seen it morph. And one of the big thing is when you're plugged in, which we all are in some way or another, individually and in companies, we can't live without technology. It's only a matter of when it will happen to you, not if it's going to happen to you. If you don't ever want to be hacked or lose anything on the internet, regardless if it's your privacy or your bank account information, then you completely unplug and not use technology, right? And that's not realistic. So for
Yeah.
everyone, our baseline is not if we're going to get hacked, is when we're going to get hacked and how can we recover from it with the least amount of damage?
So you started out in consulting. You've been in enterprise sales, executive leadership. What moment did you decide I wanted to build something of my own company?
That's a really good question. So, as a little kid, I feel like, as an immigrant, I was always like very entrepreneurial. My parents, had a little small business. And so, I had to help them growing up as a kid. I've always had a job. And then, even when as early as like middle school, I remember trying to like, going to the store, buying a box of like candy and selling it in class, just to make some extra money that week. And so I think have always been very driven and really like look at, the purpose of why people work so they can live the life they want. And that's always been in the back of my head. But at the same time, I've also been in the technology industry and in cybersecurity through my professional career in enterprise and in consulting and then in sales, how the market is moving and what the needs and demand of, our economy for cybersecurity. So all of that coming together created a perfect storm. I have seen our technology evolution going from mainframe system to servers, right? Distributed
Mhm.
server system. And then after that, everything went into the cloud. Well, actually, before the cloud era happened, I've seen technology evolution going from data centers where companies were like investing in tons of money in data center to going through co-locations and sharing data centers, right? And then that eventually evolved into cloud infrastructure and now cloud services. And now we're moving into this whole new era of like data, right? With AI and intelligence. So I have been in the technology industry to see the evolution and the transformation of technology. And when I started C1Risk about 10 years ago, what I realized was there are companies at that time that were doing amazing business like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash without any data center involved, right?
Mm.
In their business model, in how they built products. And so I knew very quickly that we were going into another technology era of cloud. And I tell this story to some of the people that I mentor. I was driving on, from San Jose back to San Francisco when I was working at a company called Aviatrix. Every day when I was driving on it, I would pass by the Mountain View Google headquarter office, and the engineers will have these banners that you can see from the outside at the freeway, and it says "I love APIs," and it just like completely moved me, because it's all about like, as we look at data technology transformation, I think about how every organization have like different software. They have data that are really important and they weren't talking to each other. I was applying it to cybersecurity and in the world of governance and compliance. Like, how are we managing our data? How do we know if, your social security number is, where it reside in all these different crazy systems and file share and things like that, right? And the
Mm.
only real answer is how do we have the heartbeat to find out? And it's all through integration. So it just allowed me to keep like while I'm driving an hour each way. I just thought about how APIs can completely change how we monitor a lot of the compliance and regulatory controls that we need that are still so very manual for us to test. And I wasn't seeing the cost of auditing and compliance going down. At that time, I have been doing it for over 10, 15 years, and I felt like we were still doing it in such a manual way. And I was so inspired to develop and build a SaaS platform that was API first so that everyone can leverage this API to report on compliance from agnostic infrastructure, right? Like
Mm.
compliance is not really a area of discipline that anyone wants to innovate. It's not that fun, and the regulations are changing because people are getting damages from it. there are significant losses to our economy from data breaches and things like that. So it's not something we can ignore, but it's also something that we should do more efficiently in.
Mhm.
And so that was what inspired me to create C1Risk is I felt like number one, we need an easy SaaS software that's like TurboTax, right? Where people like don't have to think about how they do their taxes. They just fill in what they need to fill in and they upload all their documentation and click a button and file their taxes, right? Compliance should be something that simple, but it wasn't. And how do we make it that simple?
Hmm. That's very interesting. So, who are your primary customers? Who is really taking advantage of the platform today?
Yes. So our primary customers are, I would say, majority or enterprise customers that are maybe Fortune 500 and lower to private companies that are making about let's say 100 million revenue or more. And so 100 million revenue up to maybe 2 billion in revenue size company. Most of them are enterprise companies. So it's B2B sales. We do have some B2C customers, but those are a little bit more driven by like privacy rules. The B2B customers are more about accountability, share accountability. So if I'm Microsoft and I'm doing business with you, Apple, like I need to make sure that you are accountable for your cybersecurity requirements and that if I get breached because I use your product, I need to have all the T's crossed and I dot to show that you need to like pay me for my damages and my losses, right? So a lot of what's driving governance, compliance, and risk management is because we are an ecosystem. No one company operate alone without customers or without partners, right? We need
Mm.
both in order to sustain our business. And every company is looking at making sure we have terms and conditions that are clear to hold each other accountable.
Interesting. Yeah. So, what are some of the common challenges that companies come to you trying to solve?
Yeah, so it could be as simple as like I need to get a SOC 2 compliance report, and there are a couple things to it. Right now, we have a lot of companies. We don't have enough talent to do this work. Okay, and so if you don't have an experienced person that has done SOC 2 certification like 100 times, then you kind of need some guidance, right? Like you need the TurboTax walkthrough so that you know your business best and you can provide what SOC 2 needs to achieve your credentials, right? So that you can book your business. So that's one scenario. But the other scenario, which I think is where we really differentiate, is when a company is large enough where they have customer coming at them, they have regulators coming at them, and there you have more than one competing priorities. For example, if you're at a hospital, everyone thinks hospital needs to implement HIPAA privacy rules, right? Well, they also take in payments. So payment is the PCI rules, right? Like if they take
Mm.
credit cards for their copay and they have all these transactions, they have HIPAA, now they have PCI. And then, if you are also like some publicly traded company or you have a board, then they want you to have fraudulent controls on your financial reporting because you have an obligation to give your stakeholders real financial numbers to look at. You want to make sure there's fraud detection in it, right? And so we call those financial controls that is published against by the SEC guidance. So the Security Exchange Commission not only provide guidance in terms of how you need to protect from fraudulent financial reporting for publicly traded companies, but they also extend those rules to private companies. So every private company should have a standard and a way to do their accounting and their bookkeeping and their financials. So most of them, that's why you get a CPA license. That's why we call GAAP accounting rules, right?
Mm.
So from a fraud control perspective, it's also similar that in the United States, our Security Exchange Commission, SEC, set the standard of what that is. And so for most organizations, they don't only have like one compliance need, they have multiple compliance need. And so the reason why our product is really attractive is that we help them execute on how to be more efficient in all those requirements so that you can implement one set of password policy to all your system, and it will meet all these like countries and different regulations and for all these different purposes.
Okay. So who within an organization are you usually talking to and working with to implement your solution?
Yeah. So we typically talk to like three kind of different stakeholders. One is, of course, the cybersecurity officer who need to make sure those cybersecurity controls are in place. And, we have so many cybersecurity framework and different regulations. You cannot have a privacy law without security control to protect those, personal data, right? So there are so many laws that requires that, and sometimes it's the obligation of the security officer. Okay, so that's one stakeholder. The other stakeholder is general counsel. So what we're seeing is like a lot of times by having it at the security officer level is not sufficient because there are a lot of regulatory and liability things that company have to manage. And sometimes the general counsel now is being tasked to take a look at those liabilities and how to reduce those liability and how do they address like regulatory responses for their reports that has to get submitted, right, to regulatory agencies. So we're seeing more and more of this responsibility going to the general counsel office. And when that happens, we can really see the programming, and the objective of the programming is broader, more strategic at the level. So they may be looking at more than just technology controls, right? So if we work with the security officer, you might be looking at password and patching and stuff like that. But when we work with the general counsel, we're looking at operational risks, right? What happens if there's tariffs that, affects our business? What happens if, our supply chain is low or it gets disrupted, like in the event of COVID? So when we are still looking at risk and we're still looking at compliance, but the scope of the risk and compliance from the general counsel sometimes is a lot broader than just technology. And I think the third stakeholder would be the CFO or the Chief Risk Officer. Chief Risk Officer is a really, really new role for most organizations. Sometimes they don't even exist right now. I think we're barely getting like executive like board subcommittee to address risk. And so whenever we are starting to see that happen, you'll start seeing some executive level who is responsible for risk. And so the higher up you go, the better your risk that you're managing and that you're basically monitoring is, because you can look at it from my entire company, what are my risks, or you can just look at it from a very like tiny slice of like data security and technology risk.
Okay. So moving to AI a little bit more now, how have you seen over the last 10 years? You've been in this for 25 years, but really AI has been picking up steam over the last 5 or so years. How have you seen that impacting the risk landscape and the way companies are looking at risk?
Yeah. So there's a couple components. I kind of call it the triad, but there's a couple things to think about when it comes to AI and risk, right? One is like a lot of people are talking about misinformation, right? The response that you're getting from AI, can you trust that, right? So what is the best, software for blah, blah, blah? And they say it's C1Risk. Do you trust that, right? Like, so that's one aspect of a scenario. I think we need to be very mindful of coming up with the right set of standards of how you build AI software so that has a level of transparency for users to trust that information. information, right? Or allow the user to decide if they want to use the information. And I think Google is doing a really good job with that with their Gemini product. Anytime you see a Gemini response, it follows by sources that it cites from all of the Google search index and stuff like that. So I think they're doing a great job and they're kind of leading in terms of how to present AI data in that sense. I think the other part of AI, when I think about AI, is I think about the LLM models, right? Your learning models. What data are you training on? How much data do you need to get a level of accuracy that people find useful? And I think when I think about that, I think the only way is to really get expert involved in the models that you're training, right? So to me, I really think that we're still in a really early stage of all these training models. Some of them are really powerful already, but in the world of GRC, I don't think that we have a dominant learning GRC player. So if you ask any regulatory related stuff, or if you want to know about which vendor has the highest risk and all that stuff, I think that type of AI assistant result is not far away, but I think we need to have vendors that are looking at this assistant more responsibly, right? And making sure that we are taking all the Gemini, components and design and lessons learned to make sure we pump out trusted data. So I think about that a lot because I think with C1Risk being a risk and compliance management platform, we have a lot of inside data, and we have a lot of data that are not in the public internet domain, but they are all going to be extremely useful if we use it responsibly in a safe way. So I think about the AI assistants and how we can make AI results more reliable and useful to improve our ROI and efficiency of how we do work. And then the last part about AI that I think a lot about is the cost of AI. Everyone wants to talk about AI, everyone wants to use AI, and when they use it on Google, it's free, but it's not really free because Google makes their money from ads, right? So when you ask AI features and function of your vendors, how are you planning to pay for it? How are those AI features and function built? How are you able to scale, right? So I look at it from a cost modeling perspective. I see it as no different than any other enterprise project. You want to be able to have enough money to POC, pilot the solution, but you also need to have enough money to roll it out and get user adoption. And then you also need to have amount of budget to sustain it and keep it going, keep the lights on, right? And so are people planning for that? Are they talking about that? And how is this going to impact, your financial forecasts?
So how is C1Risk using AI internally? Are you and building it both building it into your product as well as using it for internal tasks?
Yeah. We are doing both and we're doing it very cautiously. So internally, we're using it to do a lot of research, right? Not only, so every department is using AI differently and there's a purpose for that. So for example, our marketing department, we're using it, and I think this is a very useful way of using AI is how do we translate our content, our usable content that we interface with users to help them use our tool better or publish knowledge articles? How do we do that at an international language scale, right? So instead of having hire someone to translate it to Spanish or French or whatever, leveraging AI to assist us in building, these training material and multiplying it so that we can get to as many people as possible. So I think that's a really interesting use case from a language perspective. And then on the engineering side, we have been, asking ourselves can AI do the code for us? And the answer has always been no, because, our product is very complex and very specialized. You just can't take an apple and spit it out. That's just not how complex system works. However, can we take a snippet of our code and say, hey, AI, tell me what bugs or what use cases we're missing, right? Or can you write test cases for us from a quality assurance perspective? We're finding that to be very helpful. And then I think the other thing is like using the right AI product for the right purpose, right? Like I'm not going to go on ChatGPT and say, "Hey ChatGPT, tell me how to redesign this page," because it doesn't have the best LLM for that, right? We go to
Mhm.
V for that, right? So there are multiple and now more sophisticated AI models now that we can choose from to help us work better and more efficiently.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And what kind of AI tools are being built into the product for the clients?
Yeah, so on our product side, we want to be playing at the layer of AI assistance, okay? And what that means is if I'm going to assist you virtually to write better cybersecurity policy, it's a very different useful workflow and model than if I'm going to assist you from identifying risk to your supply chain, okay?
Mhm.
So those are two different agents. And in order for me to look at your supply chain and tell you where you have the most risk or what risks is you're exposed to, where to focus your effort on when it comes to all your vendors, those are very specific use cases and rule set and data set that we need to make that happen versus writing policies, right?
Mhm.
So our strategy is to play at the assistant level and build the best GRC assistant tools for the purpose that it serves.
What's a big milestone or North Star that you're chasing over the next 12 months?
Yeah, our big milestone in North Star is to really tune and build our learning model for AI for GRC. We want to be the best like risk, data that is useful for our customer because I see our product very much so as a productivity tool. So the vision of having like a Gemini experience for high quality risk data that's relevant to all the regulations that we follow is really exciting. I think the other North Star for us is KRIs and KPIs. We really want to be the leading tool for risk management. I think we have an opportunity at that, especially now with AI providing infinite outlook for risks that are impacting different sectors and over the world in different languages at, speed of time. So I feel like by adding our expertise and knowledge in terms of what to do with risk, how to evaluate risk, it can really make a difference.
So, what are some bottlenecks or challenges that you've been facing in growing the company in that regard?
I think that the biggest bottleneck is definitely like always, balancing resources and demand, right? It's a fine balance. Like if we build it, are the customer gonna use it? Right? If we're too forward thinking, or are we building features and functions that our customers are asking for now and holding out the R&D work for AI? So I think those are always going to be a fine balance for us to juggle. And I think the other fine balance is talent scouting, right? Like right now, the AI talent demand is really, really high. And unless you're like Google or Meta, or OpenAI that is paying, six-figure digit bonuses to hire talent, it's always going to be a risk. However, I think that if we let this ecosystem play out, we will eventually be able to get access to like cheaper chips and resources and better models to leverage at the application layer.
So, how about from the go to market perspective? You're working with some of these very large companies. What is the process of getting in the door? And have there been any challenges or barriers there?
Yeah, I think that the go-to-market strategy for any startup is to stay really, really focused because you can really work yourself and dilute everything that you do, right? Because at the end of the day, you need to build a product that is really meaningful for your customer who is using it. And even in the world of risk and compliance, there are different terminologies and different culture that each industry have, right? And so for us, I think the most important focus for go to market is to be very industry and sector based so that we can serve the community that have like problems, like solutions, and help them be a lot more efficient as a community.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are you actively pursuing funding? Are you guys bootstrapped? Where are you at in that regard?
But yeah, we are currently bootstrapped and it's been a really great journey. And I think, we are always open to working with the right partners from a funding perspective. And ultimately is to make sure that, the company continues to keep growing and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
definitely. So, getting to the end here, it sounds like you've had an incredible journey so far. Hypothetically, if you had a magic wand and could fix one thing or change one thing in the business right now that's either holding you back or slowing you down, what would that one thing be?
I feel like the practice of compliance and reporting on compliance shouldn't be, that many clones, that many workflow differences. I think that, I feel like companies getting a little bit more flexibility or being a little bit open-minded to adjust how they're doing things now for a greater return in the future to make it faster. I think that will be a huge win for everybody, right?
Mm,
I think as long as we want software to be customized to only one company can use it, I think those days are kind of old way of thinking because we're all looking to scale and it's not like compliance, it's like most people's core business. So it's probably better to have a TurboTax than a custom app.
yeah, certainly. Oh, Lily, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me and coming on the show. For those who want to learn more about your work and connect with you, where can they find you?
They can find me and our team at C1Risk.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening today. If you enjoyed this show, please be sure to subscribe, leave us a review. And as always, keep pitching, keep building, and keep scaling.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pitch, Build, Scale. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast provider so you never miss an episode, and we'll see you next time.